And so, I propose we focus on public improvement projects. Not only will this have an immediately positive impact on our neighborhood, but it will both endear our organization to the locals and differentiate us from the gangs as a source of constructive employment. I looked up from my page of notes, densely covered in a scrawl of mixed Kanji and Germanian, and met Naoto's gaze from across the table. And now, to conclude. As such, we should prioritize importing staple foods in bulk, multivitamins, and portable water purifiers. While this will have a less immediate impact than handing out weapons to anybody who can use them, it will likely produce more long-term support without attracting immediate retaliation from the gangs. Not to mention that untrained fools running around with guns would be more likely to shoot each other than the Britannians. Of course, I continued, the question of funding presents a potential stumbling block. As always, the hardest part of any pitch was convincing the client to part with their cash. And unfortunately, there really was no way around it. At the moment, we lack the necessary revenue streams to initiate a true revitalization project, not to mention that any sign of sudden prosperity in the ghetto runs the risk of attracting interest from the Britannians or the gangs. Shifting the focus from the lack of organizational liquidity to other concerns would help the medicine go down. However, I believe that a pilot program funded by the income from the raid 2 days ago will demonstrate the potential benefits this program has to offer. The morning after I'd met with Ogi and Ino, I had woken even earlier than normal and begun to assemble a new strategic pitch based on what I'd learned and seen. I'd worked through the day, weighing ideas and trying to suss out all points of failure, and had ended up burning through several plans before settling on my current concept. At present, the Kozuki cell in Shinjuku was weak, and wouldn't be able to attack either the gangs or the Britannians head-on. We'd only achieved our first minor victory through ambush, and I couldn't count on my luck holding, not with Being X no doubt still laughing at me from his timeless moments. After some wargaming, I decided that attempting to subtly escalate hostilities between the gangs would be a bad move. Even if we weren't caught in the inevitable crossfire, lots of ordinary civilians would be, which would go against the stated aim of the organization with minimal benefit. Besides, Japanese civilians wouldn't be the only ones potentially caught in the crossfire, considering the number of Britannians who attended various unsavory entertainments hosted by the gangs, and nothing would stir up official interest in Shinjuku faster than dead Britannian nobles. My next thought was trying to take the fight to the Britannian concession, specifically the newly dubbed Tokyo settlement. Unfortunately, the difficulty of smuggling things into the concession, as well as our lack of the necessary expertise and material, forced me to shelve this plan for the foreseeable future. Similarly, my plan to begin generating funding for the rebellion by smuggling amphetamines and other drugs into the concession had to be shelved for the same reasons. We lacked the expertise and material to really establish a profitably large supply of drugs to distribute in the Britannian sectors, as well as the means to smuggle the product from Shinjuku to the Tokyo settlement. But while smuggling items from Shinjuku into the Tokyo settlement was difficult, the inverse wasn't necessarily true. If Ino and Ogi were correct, large numbers of Britannian nobles, soldiers, and commoners were coming to the Shinjuku ghetto on a routine basis, and were greasing the palms of the guards to take no official notice of them or their activities. This meant that not only were significant numbers of the local garrison willing to be bribed, they were also unconcerned about items being smuggled into Shinjuku. Ultimately, the best plan I could come up with was to adopt a more constructive approach towards our dealings with the people of Shinjuku. The people here had virtually nothing beyond the clothes on their backs. Starvation and disease were constant facts of life, and the squalid living conditions did nothing to improve either the health or the long-term prospects of the people. Giving them anything would help us secure both their loyalty and the bona fides as true defenders of the Japanese man in the street. I figured that the best place to start would be addressing the ever-mounting food shortage. Importing bulk amounts of staple grains into the ghetto would at least keep bellies full, while bringing in multivitamins would hopefully offset the results of nutritional deficiencies, like scurvy and rickets. Water purifiers would help reduce the negative health factors of life in Shinjuku, and would hopefully reduce the high post-conquest rate of child mortality as well, preserving the labor force of tomorrow. Naoto looked thoughtful as I shuffled my notes. I hoped at least some of what I'd said had gotten through to him. I knew he was a hot-blooded sort, and this sort of non-confrontational strategy probably hadn't been what he'd been hoping for since he'd promoted me after my strike on the gang members. But I'd made sure to frame my plan as merely preparatory, building up our base of public support and personnel before we struck out against the parasitic gangs and the hated invaders. Finally, he stirred. "Well, Tanya, this is certainly ambitious. You've got some really great ideas here. But..." He paused, looking unsure of what to say next, and leaving me full of anxiety as the momentary pause stretched on. But what? What's your objection? Just spit it out already." Before Naoto could express his reservations, someone knocked on the apartment door. With an expression of clear relief, Naoto leapt to his feet and looked into the peephole. I quickly spun up my enhancements, ready to hurl myself towards the pistol concealed behind a pot on the counter, but relaxed as Naoto let Callan into the room. The younger Kozuki looked incongruously out of place in the dingy apartment, sparkling clean in clothes that, while not flashy, were a significant step above the shabby hand-me-downs worn by practically everyone else in Shinjuku. In a peculiar way, her blatantly Britannian appearance probably kept her safer than any attempt at blending in would have, considering the typical punishment meted out for any Britannian death. I could only imagine that the standard 100 punitive executions would likely be far more enthusiastic than normal if the Britannian in question was the pretty young daughter of a powerful lord, instead of some random worker or soldier. "Callan. Good to see you. How was school?" Naoto enthusiastically greeted his sister as she walked over to the table and took the seat he'd just occupied. I nodded at her, and she smiled and nodded back at me before turning back to her brother. "It's got way too many Britannians in it, just like the rest of Japan," Callan quipped, a sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes on her face. "That said, it's gotten pretty interesting lately." She turned back to me and dropped the smile. "So, I met someone who might be a useful source of info, but she keeps dropping hints that she knows something about me." Behind her, I saw Naoto's eyes widen in alarm, and I did my best to avoid following suit. I can't lose my cool in front of the troops, but this could be bad. If Callan's been found out, she could have just led the whole Britannian army to our door. I took a deep, calming breath, and put aside my worry. If we were already doomed, we were doomed, and there was no use panicking about it. "Callan, are you in danger? More to the point, are we about to get our door kicked down by the Britannians?" She looked puzzled, then laughed. No. I was thinking the same thing when I first met her, but she said she knew a secret of mine in the middle of a hallway at school, and has been hanging out with me ever since." Naoto and I relaxed, releasing our breaths in sync. "It's starting to piss me off," Callan continued, looking increasingly frustrated. "That damned Millie Ashford just isn't leaving me alone. Anytime I'm outside of class, she's practically hanging off my shoulder. She even follows me into the bathroom." Now Naoto looked concerned for a different reason, but I set aside his brotherly worries and focused on the name Callan had just dropped. "Millie Ashford? Any relation to the Ashford who started the academy?" "Yeah, she's old Reuben Ashford's granddaughter. He's still running Ashford Academy, by the way." Callan took back the notebook, and turned to a page near the back before pushing it back across the table. "Anyway, here's what I know about her so far. Apparently, the Ashfords weren't actually nobility, at least not anymore. They'd backed the wrong horse during one of the royal family's internal squabbles, and been stripped of their titles as a result, but apparently not their wealth or much of their property. They had chosen to exile themselves in Area 11 after the conquest, and had opened the doors of Ashford Academy a year after arriving. Why would a disgraced noble family move to Japan and start an educational institution? It made no sense, as far as a strategy to reclaim their standing as aristocrats went. No matter how valuable they are for the administration, nor how many contacts they make with the local movers and shakers, Area 11 is pretty provincial as far as imperial areas go. The only truly important thing about Area 11 is its strategic Sakuradite Reserve, but that was almost certainly locked down under the personal supervision of the royal family. I set my curiosity about the Ashford family's status aside for the moment, and quickly read the profile Callan had drawn up for Millie. It sounded like the girl was every inch a noble, official status notwithstanding, a consummate socialite and completely unable to separate business and pleasure. She certainly wasn't a fool, though, Based on Callan's notes, Millie was frighteningly good at uncovering secrets and deploying them to devastating social effect, and had essentially unquestioned control over the student body beyond what the cachet of being the principal's granddaughter could explain. Combined with her apparent equal access to student records, I could understand why Callan was attempting to cultivate Millie as a source. That said, a knife that sharp can cut both ways. Be very careful with her, Callan, I advised as I closed the notebook and handed it back. She's a master of intrigue, and you're just a novice. Don't let her get in your head, remember your objective, and don't let her endanger you or the cause. Callan gave a determined nod, and I smiled. She's so dutiful. And those were pretty thorough notes for an amateur, and very well organized. If she knows how to brew coffee, she might make a good adjunct. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, and ignored the phantom scent of ersatz yet delicious coffee, mixed with cordite and mud. That was long ago, and far away. Naoto and Callan were both looking at me, and both looked worried about something. For lack of a better response, I gave my usual dimple smile and shrug combination, hoping the cutesy act would distract from whatever it was that had made them look at me with the same pity you show a crippled relative stuck in a hospital bed, the same contempt veiled in compassion that way. Oh, I've got an idea. Naoto's blatantly fake cheeriness was as welcome as it was forced, moving the conversation along. Callan, Tanya wants to look into buying some good food outside of Shinjuku, why don't you help her with that? And suddenly I felt like I was back in the middle of that damned photoshoot, the photographer oohing and eyeing over me, and forcing me into the most ridiculous outfits. Callan's eyes seemed to change, shifting from her typically intense glare to a more coldly analytical focus. We're going to have to get her in some better clothes first. Callan's voice had changed too, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach at the note of eagerness under the detached tone. I've got some old clothes that might just be a bit too big for her back at the manor. Naoto smiled with apparent sincerity at this idea, and I felt the jaws of inescapable fate close around me. I'm not some kind of doll, damn it. Why do people get so enthusiastic about dressing me up? Apparently, my consternation was not as well hidden as I thought, as Naoto's smile slipped momentarily when he looked back at me, but he recovered immediately. Come on, Tanya, it's a great idea. You'll get some new clothes, some good food. What's not to like? Naoto's damned charisma made my initial objections about being subjected to this errand catch in my throat, and I felt myself beginning to slip down the path to meek acquiescence. Gah. No, I need to come up with something. The last thing I need is to show up looking even more Britannian than I already do. Tamaki will never take me seriously. I cast around, trying to find something to object about. Fortunately, Callan threw me a lifeline. Well, she does look pretty Britannian with those blue eyes, but she doesn't speak English. It's going to be a problem getting through the checkpoint, especially if the damned guards actually feel like doing their jobs. Naoto nodded at that, before adopting a thoughtful expression. Maybe she could just pretend to be very shy and quiet. You can do the talking, and translate for Tanya once you reach the grocery store? And now I had a different problem. I did know some English from my first life and from the first years of schooling I'd had in this life, but I was certainly rusty at best. The problem was that my value as a potential infiltrator into Britannian society would drop like a stone if Naoto thought I couldn't speak the language. And so, for the first time in over 5 years, I decided to take a stab at speaking the tongue of perfidious Albion. I Avenue. Some English. My voice was slow and halting, the unfamiliar consonants catching in my mouth. I was top student in school before. On one hand, I hated how childish I sounded. My clunky sentence structure, the halting gaps as I grasped for words, the way my already high voice piped at the end of sentences, all of it was embarrassing. On the other hand, the surprise on the Kozuki siblings' faces was delicious, particularly Callan's open-mouthed gape as I forced the sentences out. Z teacher, said Ivas. Quick study, I continued, trying to remember how to make the th sound and trying to figure out why my enunciation was so clearly Germanian. I hadn't learned English from a German in my first life or a Germanian in the second, but clearly years of speaking one Western language had impacted my accent in another. But I only remember Z basic vocabulary. I fear. Naoto was grinning like a fool, the bastard, and clapped me on the back. "You're already speaking better than half the hooligans in our old neighborhood," he said in English, taking care to speak slowly and deliberately before switching back to Japanese. "Don't worry, you can just reply to everybody who asks you a question with whatever dash. You're almost a teenager, they'll expect you to be a passive-aggressive little brat at your age." Callan sure was. As the ensuing sibling squabble played out in the background, I surrendered to the inevitable and began to pull on my shoes. My hand itched to snag my pistol, to not enter enemy territory unarmed, but I knew that a shabbily dressed apparent Britannian would be one thing for the soldiers manning the checkpoint to overlook, an armed vagrant would be something entirely different. And so, sadly unarmed, I followed Callan out of the apartment and down into the street. As we walked towards the checkpoint, the familiar anxiety of walking into a major meeting unprepared began to grow within me. There were so many points of failure in this little excursion alone, and I lacked information I needed to ensure my safe return to Shinjuku. Will anyone recognize my accent and think I'm a European spy? How am I going to carry my purchases back into Shinjuku without getting stopped? Will the soldiers manning the checkpoint ask for my papers? Fortunately, that last concern proved almost completely unwarranted. "Ah, Lady Stadtfeld. You're back already, huh?" All of the soldiers looked identical in their body armor and full-face helmets, but I saw a chevron on the shoulder of the one who greeted Callan as she presented her ID. "I don't blame you for hurrying, the whole place is just full of the stench of 11s, huh?" I tensed slightly, remembering the fire in Callan's eyes back on that lonely street. Fortunately, she demonstrated an admirable degree of professional detachment. Somewhere between Nato's apartment and here, Callan's persona had changed completely. Instead of her typical intense stare, full of passion and vigor, her eyes were meek and soft, as was her voice as she replied. "Thank you for your concern, Sergeant. I managed to complete Mother's errand unexpectedly quickly today." She stepped through the checkpoint and waved at me, beckoning me to join her. I quickly reviewed how Callan had she'd carried herself, squared my shoulders, and walked up to the checkpoint. "And who's this?" The sergeant was unsurprisingly unimpressed by my diminutive form, and I did my best to not shrink back. I'd killed men like him by the hundred over the Rhine front, and I'd killed 2 more with just a knife and the element of surprise only days ago. I was unarmed, but I was far from helpless. "Where's your papers, girl?" Callan walked to my side, and put a hand on my shoulder. "Mother sent me to retrieve her. It's not something I'm at liberty to discuss, Sergeant. I thank you for your discretion in this matter." She reached out towards the soldier, and I saw a quick flash of a small bundle of bills changing hands. Surprisingly, he didn't even count it, just hastily made it disappear into a pouch on his belt. "Well, far be it to get in the way of your mother's errands, Lady Stadtfeld." He stepped back, and waved us through. "But if you want my advice, you should probably give the poor girl a meal and a bath. She stinks almost as bad as one of those monkeys if I can smell her through this helmet." Callan dutifully thanked the sergeant and bade him a good day, as I quietly stood slightly behind her, doing my best to ignore the squad of armed soldiers idling about the checkpoint. I didn't know if they would have been as willing to accept a bribe in the broad daylight if I had looked even the slightest bit like an 11, or if the person facilitating my exit from Shinjuku wasn't the heir of a noble house, but either way it had proved immaterial. Locating a source of ID cards, papers, and cover identities is going to be a priority. After passing through the checkpoint, Callan and I moved off down the road at an unhurried pace, doing our best to look as natural as possible. At least, I had to try to look natural and uninterested in the world around me. This was the first time I had left Shinjuku Ghetto since my mother and I had been forced into the district after the conquest. For years, my world had been constrained by the Britannian checkpoints and the walls that cordoned off most of the ghetto from the outside world. While the northwestern side of the ghetto, the furthest area from the Tokyo settlement, didn't have a wall, it was also far enough away by foot that I'd never ranged that far from my old apartment when looking for work. It felt like I'd once again traveled to a different world. The handful of people out on the street around me reminded me of American television shows I'd occasionally watched in my first life, more than anything else. Predominantly Caucasian, the people around me dressed in a wide variety of clothes, and all of them seemed to practically glow with health and cleanliness. Thinking rationally, I knew they were just people, No different than the standard Japanese crowds that had occupied the Tokyo of my first life, and in some ways less remarkable than the magical imperials of my second lifespan. But, after so long in the slums, they looked almost like a different species. They even carried themselves differently. In the slums, most people carried the burdens of their life under occupation on their backs, but here all the Britannians walked upright with pride. Suddenly, I realized just how out of place I looked. It had been easy to understand that intellectually back in Shinjuku, especially after meeting Callan for the first time and being reminded what people with food security looked like, but the emotional weight hadn't quite hit. In Shinjuku, Callan looked ridiculously out of place, and it was easy to dismiss my own qualms about my appearance due to both the sheer incongruity of her appearance in the slum and her family's excellent genes. Outside of the ghetto, the novelty of her appearance had worn off, but the differences were just as profound. The weight of how wretched I looked sank into my bones as I thought about the heavily worn and mended clothes I was wearing, and how the bones stood out in my hands. The momentary shame quickly sublimated into an internal rage, and I found myself sympathizing with Tamaki's reaction to an apparent Brit in his safe house. The simple knowledge of how wide the gulf was between how our two populations lived was infuriating, and I wanted nothing more than to see everything around me burn. These happy people weren't better than me. They'd had the freedom to go to school, the freedom to eat their fill, and the freedom to enjoy life and to pursue their enjoyments. For them, the prospect of a middle management job at a good company or in the administration's bureaucracy wasn't a grand ambition, but a solid career goal. I'm sure if any of them knew my secret ambition, they'd think it terribly small and pedestrian. One day, I swore as Callan and I arrived at a bus stop, one day I'll collect every bit of back pay and every reimbursement the world, the Holy Britannian Empire, and being Exomi. The bus was on time, and as clean and pleasant as the streets it trundled down. The walls and seats were free of graffiti, no haunting smell of urine lingered, and the bus driver smiled and greeted us as Callan swept her card through the reader twice, paying our fare. I noticed the driver was 11, and thus an honorary Britannian, and I couldn't find it in me to hate him or his choice to collaborate. His eyes were downcast, but his cheeks were full and rounded. Clearly, his decision to participate in the new order when given the choice had yielded a degree of material benefit. I can't say that I wouldn't have made the same choice, if it had ever been offered to me, and if I felt for an instant that all the propaganda about honorary Britannians having a path to successful integration in the empire was true. I doubted this man or his children would ever rise above being bus drivers or other menial jobs, but that also implied that he would live long enough to have children, a victory in itself. Callan and I found our way to seats, and sat quietly as the bus continued along its route. Callan pulled out her phone, and appeared to be texting somebody, but I didn't want to ask her about it here. Speaking in Japanese would have immediately revealed our personal loyalties, and my atrocious English would be almost equally suspicious. Instead, I looked out the window as the Tokyo settlement went past, and discovered what our conquerors had built atop the land they had stolen from us. I had never had much interest in architecture, beyond marveling at the sprawling heap that was the Imperial Army's general headquarters, but even I could see that the entire concession was full of new construction. Everything was very Western, of course, and I couldn't see any hint of Japanese accents or flavors in any of the immaculate structures. Strangely enough, it didn't look particularly American either, which I would have expected considering the geographic location of the Britannian homeland. Instead, it felt more like the Gothic style of the Renaissance, crossed with some author's view of a city of tomorrow, all expressed in ultra-modern materials. Like most things Britannian, the city that they had built was gaudy, inefficient, and egotistical in the extreme. This was the full expression of the ancient tradition of absolute monarchism, unbridled by even a fig leaf of constitutional government and reliant upon the divine right of kings and naked force. Between the communists and the monarchists, it's hard to decide which is the more illogical and inefficient system of governance. Eventually, we ended up at a stop in a very nice neighborhood, full of gigantic houses that practically dripped with ostentation. I noticed Callan slip a bill into the small tip box hanging by the driver's station as we made our way off, which was interesting. I had pegged the Kozuki siblings as being driven into taking up arms against Britannia by a combination of ideological and mercenary factors. While they definitely had beefs against the Britannian racial caste system, they were also using the resistance to install a rival faction into power. Neither motivation explained Callan's apparent sympathy for honorary Britannians, though, and I was somewhat surprised by her tender-heartedness. Surely an anti-Britannian zealot would have held collaborators and traitors to the cause in contempt, and a mercenary fighting for their family's glory and power would not care about the well-being of a lowly, honest worker. As I tried to decipher what Callan was signaling with this small act, we began to walk down the spacious boulevard, past gated house after gated house. Although, house didn't really encompass the mini Versailles set back from the road by at least a few hundred meters, each surrounded with gardens and lawns. Pocket-sized or not, they were shockingly huge and luxuriously decadent for being only a half-hour away from Shinjuku by public transport. Okay, so, before we get to my family's manor, there's a few things you need to know. Callan spoke in Japanese, low and fast, as we proceeded. Her face had begun to redden along her cheekbones, but her expression displayed angry resentment rather than any embarrassment. After my father returned to Japan after the conquest, he looked up his old family again. My mother, Callan's usually attractive face twisted in disdain, was of course all too happy to pick back up again with him. To be a family again. The redhead sneered at the idea, and I kept silent, nodding along attentively to show I was listening. I knew that Naoto and Callan had come into contact with their noble father again after a separation during the conquest, and for some reason their father had picked Callan to be his heir. Judging by the sheer vitriol in the girl's voice, she had strong, unresolved feelings about the matter. Anyway, Naoto was pretty happy to see him again too. They'd been really close, back before he left us, and he'd sent enough money to keep us housed and fed, so I could understand that. Callan's face relaxed, the sneer falling away and leaving an expression of weary acceptance behind. I mean, he wasn't as bad as he could have been. I know that he took care of us, gave us money and stuff, but... She kicked at a trash can as we passed. He wasn't there, damn it. Naoto had to constantly fight every damned Britannian piece of shit in the neighborhood after father decided to start paying for our housing again, and somehow Naoto did a better job helping me and mom out than he did. We walked a bit further as Callan took some deep breaths and tried to calm down. I felt entirely at a loss about what to say to any of this. I'd felt the same way before, when Callan had been trying to deal with the aftermath of her first kill, but that was something I understood, and something I could help with. At least my mother never left me. I had sometimes wondered, back at the orphanage, what it would have been like to meet my second life's biological parents, assuming being X hadn't just created my body from thin air and stuffed my soul into it. Would I have had the same feelings of angry betrayal that Callan had, if I'd ever met the woman who'd abandoned her baby with the nuns? I'm pretty sure he wanted to adopt Naoto as his legitimate heir and son, but I guess Naoto just looked too Japanese to pass as a full Britannian. It was interesting that Callan and Naoto didn't exhibit any sibling rivalry. It sounded like Naoto had done the hard work of keeping Callan and their mother alive during the initial post-conquest years, but when the boss had come back, his little sister had gotten the job as official heir and the cushy lifestyle attached. Maybe he was just too interested in fighting, and didn't want the political and social burdens? He basically gave Naoto whatever he wanted in terms of money and his blessing, and sent him on his way. Was that when the plan for Lord Statfeld's gambit had begun? She didn't mention anything like the father and son working on a plan or a project. Did neither of them actually tell her the plan? That would explain why she didn't understand the implications of her schooling. Or is she just doing her job and maintaining information security? I felt like I was missing some key aspect to the whole plan, and it made me uneasy, but I decided I could consider that later and refocused on Callan's continuing briefing on her family. Of course, he didn't marry my mother, she's a common 11, and she started going a bit crazy after father abandoned us for years. Definitely not marriage material for a noble. But, he did feel sorry for her, so he graciously gave her a job as a maid. Callan's words dripped with a level of sarcasm reserved for teenagers, and she clearly didn't understand how thoroughly she'd misunderstood the situation. Her father had given her mother a job where he could easily carry on an affair with her at any given moment, where she had an excuse to be around her daughter all day, and where he could make sure nothing too consequential happened to her. My mother had been a common prostitute, and she'd slept with a bastard of a landlord in exchange for a single small room. It sounded like Callan's mother had negotiated a far better deal from her client. But, being a noble, he had to marry someone, because otherwise he'd look weak. Thing was, nobody really wanted to marry their daughters to him, since he already had an heir, so they wouldn't have a chance to get their hands on the Stadtfeld estate. That made sense to me. The main point of aristocratic marriage was forming alliances, and if no heirs were expected out of the union, the prospect of a multi-generational alliance was unlikely. So he found a barren old bitch to marry instead. She's sterile, so her family was happy to marry her off to him, which is good and all for him, but she absolutely hates me. Not particularly surprising. It must be frustrating to be unable to do the sole task you were brought up and trained to perform. Does she hate you because you're not her child, or does she hate you because of your heritage? I wondered aloud, mostly to just keep the conversation moving as we walked. I doubted Callan was interested in rapprochement, but I was somewhat curious about the source of the stepmother's dislike. Was she a simple racist, and thus likely not involved in Lord Stadtfeld's plan? Or was she resentful that the heir to the hidden kingdom he was setting up in the Area 11 administration wouldn't be her child? Callan merely grunted and shrugged. Dunno. Probably both. She's not exactly a fan of Japanese, but the only non-Britannian servant we've got is my mother. She might just hate her because, well, she kind of waved at herself, before shrugging again. It's not really important. What is important is that we get in, get you changed, and get out as fast as possible. I've never. She started to blush, and sped up slightly for some reason, and I had to rely on my enhanced strength to keep up with her pace. I've never brought a friend home before, and I don't want her asking who you are or anything like that. Finally, we were moving back to something I could understand. Tactical objectives and planning were, of course, second nature to me after my acceptable performance at the Imperial War Academy. I was certain I'd be able to throw a plan together to get me to Callan's room, secure the objective, and escape out the door without being detected. However, my planning acumen went unused, as Callan simply greeted the man at the front gate of her manor's property and strode in like she had every right to be there, which I suppose she did, sweeping me along in her wake. As we approached the house, she began to slow down, eventually coming to the door at a sedate and ladylike walk. The doorman bowed as she entered, and didn't so much as raise an eyebrow as I followed her inside. I tried to emulate the dainty, almost mincing gait Callan adopted as we crossed the foyer, but after nearly tripping myself I simply resumed my typical walk instead, keeping behind her as we climbed up a sprawling flight of stairs and crept down a hallway. The floor was covered with a plush carpet with thick pile, which muffled the sounds of our feet, and we went some distance into the manor before we encountered anybody else. She was dressed in a traditional Victorian maid's uniform, complete with white apron and long sweeping skirt, but her eyes and facial shape betrayed her Japanese ethnicity. As we approached, she turned and looked at us, and before she bowed I could tell she was Naoto's mother. She had the same nose and cheekbones as her son, and strangely for a Japanese woman, the same blue eyes as both of her children. Beyond her eyes, she looked nothing like her daughter. It's strange that both of her children are redheads when she's a brunette. Is the red hair allele not recessive in this world? Unlike her children, Ms. Kozuki's eyes looked almost blank in their placidity. Her expression reminded me of many of my neighbors in Shinjuku, and I internally revised my estimation of Lord Stadtfeld's actions in regards to his paramour. If he had tried to keep her close to protect her and his daughter, he'd clearly failed. She had the same despairing cast to her features that many Japanese had, the look of people caught in terrible situations without any hope of a better life. "Oh, Mistress Callan. Good morning to you. I see you've brought a friend home with you today." Miss Kozuki's voice was quiet and deferential, and she bobbed her head as she addressed her daughter. It was heartening to see that, for all the burden on the woman's shoulders, she was still able to act with professionalism, even when in private with only her daughter and her daughter's friend. It's such a pity that more people can't remain professional while on the clock when they've got friends or family hanging around. It was part of the reason I'd never pursued any work friendships in my first or second lives. It was too easy to get distracted from the job at hand if you focused on your social life instead. Callan's response was decidedly less professional, and entirely unbecoming for a superior speaking to a valued employee, much less a family member. "Shut up. It's none of your business. We're going to my room." Without any further explanation, Callan swept on down the hall, leaving her mother behind. The maid didn't seem angry, or even offended. She simply let out a slight sigh, smiled briefly at me, and then returned to scrubbing the windowsill she'd been cleaning. I was tempted to offer a word of solidarity, as 111 to another, but instead I straightened my shoulders and followed Callan. As far as Miss Kozuki knew, I was a Britannian friend of Callan's, if a shabbily dressed and unwashed one, and nothing worth particular note. Any expression of sympathy could endanger my cover, and so I moved on. Plus, the last thing I wanted to do was insert myself into the Stadtfeld family's drama. Nobles walked the path of daggers, and the last thing I needed was to earn the personal displeasure of an aristocrat. As soon as Callan closed the door behind us, she returned to her normal speed and darted across the room to a walk-in closet, directing me towards the ensuite bathroom with its shower before disappearing inside. Within minutes, I forced myself to step out of the luxuriously hot shower, using the ridiculously soft and plush towel to dry my hair. How long has it been, I wondered to myself, since I was last this clean? I'd occasionally had the opportunity to use one of the small shower cubicles in the communal bathroom in Naoto's apartment building, but if the water pressure high enough for the showers to function, the spray was ice cold. Using quality soap was amazing too. The only soap available in Shinjuku was rough and homemade, and using it on my hair always made it feel rough and scratchy afterwards. Using scented shampoo and conditioner was a luxury I hadn't known I'd missed. Leaving the bathroom in my underwear and holding my Shinjuku clothes, and how had I not noticed how badly they smelled? Blood, and sweat, and filth. How long have I been wearing them? I found a small pile of clothing accumulating as Callan shuttled back and forth from the closet, dropping off shorts, jeans, blouses, and t-shirts with each drip. Fortunately, her tastes apparently weren't towards the overly feminine, and the majority of her second-hand clothes were free of the frills that most of the Britannian women I'd seen so far seemed to favor. Doubly fortunate, Callan's appetite for dressing me up had clearly been ruined by her encounter with her mother, and so she helped me sort through her clothes with only a minimum of glee. After a bit of work, we'd sorted out 3 outfits acceptable to both of us, and Callan gave me an old backpack of hers to pack the 2 extra outfits, my Shinjuku clothes, a discarded jacket, and some of my future grocery purchases in. I managed to dodge all skirts and dresses, and wound up in a pair of grey capri pants and a loose white peasant-style blouse. These admittedly clashed badly with the battered and stained sneakers I wore, but Callan hadn't retained any of the shoes she'd worn before her pubescent growth had begun. While my new clothes were decidedly baggy on me, hanging off my hips and shoulders, I now looked like a skinny anorexic Britannian adolescent, a step in the right direction. We left Callan's room and began retracing our footsteps, heading back towards the door and, assuming being X didn't screw with me again, groceries, but as Callan closed the door behind her I heard a raised voice coming from around the bend in the hallway ahead of us. Instantly, I was sure the lady of the house had learned that an intruder had infiltrated her family's home, and began to bitterly regret giving in to Naoto and Callan when they'd stopped me from bringing my gun. I crept forward, towards the junction, thanking Lord Stadtfeld for investing in such luxurious carpeting. As I approached the corner, I began to pick out words from the ongoing harangue. Wrong with you? Can't you do anything right? I don't know why we bother to keep you around. Thankfully, my initial worst-case assumption was wrong this time. Instead of sounding the alarm about a thief or rebel here to murder her in her bed, the elder Lady Stadtfeld was simply berating a hapless servant. Hopefully, she'd leave the poor fool alone sooner rather than later. I felt Callan move up behind me, and held up a hand to halt her. There was no need for Lady Stadtfeld to see her and start up a conversation, and if we just waited for her to go away, our objective would be complete. I peeked out, just slightly to see if the aristocrat was heading our way, which would mean we'd likely have to climb out a second-story window to avoid detection. Fortunately, the back of a richly dressed blonde whom I could only assume was Callan's barren stepmother was turned towards me, alleviating that particular worry. As I started to pull my head back to bunker down and wait for the roving irritation to leave us, I tuned back into her ranting in time to catch well. You are just a filthy 11. I suppose the blood always outs, eh? The only thing you know how to do is sell your body, you wretched whore. Admittedly, I knew I should stay quiet and stick with my mission plan. I knew I should consider the situation rationally, and realize that nothing I did here would improve the situation. I knew that, but a memory of mother, wincing from the bruises on her arms and thighs, spoon-feeding me broth. A memory of mother weeping in the other room, the sound mixed with rhythmic grunting that my thin pillow couldn't quite keep out. A memory of Ogi and Naoto talking when they thought I was asleep, just another 11 whore, beaten to death in the slum. Nobody's going to care, Naoto, especially since she usually worked near the barracks. Probably ran into a crowd of drunk soldiers, you know how that story goes. Before I knew it, I was halfway down the hall and picking up speed, my hands clasped and raised over my head. The blood hammered in my ears, and I could see the bitch starting to turn at the sound of rushing feet, but by then I was already leaping through the air and bringing down a hammer blow at the base of her neck, slamming all 50 pounds of me into her spine and knocking her to the floor. She landed face down, head bouncing off the soft carpet, and before I could think about it I followed my training, and guaranteed that she was out of the fight by kicking her in the side of the head. I pulled it slightly, so I didn't break her neck, but I was confident that the target was down. I looked up from the crumpled woman on the ground, and met the eyes of Ms. Kozuki, stock still with her cleaning rag still in her hands. Behind me, Callan rushed up, and quietly cursed in Japanese at the sight of her stepmother. For a moment, time seemed to hang still, before I snapped out of whatever idiocy I just experienced, and started trying to fix the situation. You too. Get her into her bed, get some ice on her neck to reduce the swelling and pour some of whatever she drinks on her. We need to get her out of sight before anyone else comes up. Move. Callan immediately grabbed her stepmother's legs, but Ms. Kozuki didn't move, although her eyes were wide with shock. You speak Japanese. Her voice was just as quiet as before, but the deference had been replaced by shock. With my luck, she'd faint and then Callan and I would have two bodies to move. Best not to give her any time to think. Yes, Ms. Kozuki, I speak Japanese. I'll tell you more once we're not standing over a body. Thankfully, the voice of authority worked its magic once more, and soon the Lady Stadtfeld was ensconced in her bed, a shot's worth of vodka sprinkled over her discarded clothes. Ms. Kozuki assured us that she'd get some ice for the mistress's neck once we left, but was still hanging around, looking from me to Callan with increasing concern. For a moment, I hoped Callan would say something, before deciding that I should do the talking. It was my screw-up, and I need to take responsibility for it. What a stupid thing to do. Ms. Kozuki, I am a friend of your son. A promising start, short, to the point, and establishing my credentials, as if coming in with Callan hadn't been enough. Don't worry about anything. You are doing good work, keep it up. Vague compliments aren't as effective as targeted remarks, but everybody likes a bit of flattery. Keep serving Lord Stadtfeld, and watch Callan's back. She could be in danger at any time, and you know what Britannians are like. Just keep doing what you're doing, and take care of your daughter in case your employer decided to blame her for this mess. You two are serving Japan in your own way, listen to your son, and be ready to support him when the time comes. Long live Japan. Nationalistic propaganda appeals to everybody specifically because it's general, but fosters a sense of exclusivity simultaneously. Plus, what mother doesn't like to hear praise about their children? Something in my scattergun approach seemed to have hit the mark. Miss Kozuki's mouth firmed into a determined line, and her eyes filled with resolve. She nodded, and disappeared down the hallway, and I breathed a sigh of relief, and turned to Callan. She looked flabbergasted, but visibly bit down her first response, instead muttering "We gotta go," before grabbing my hand and pulling me down the hallway after her mother. As we approached the stairs, Callan released my hand and resumed her careful, mincing pace. Together, the two of us slowly made our way across the foyer, nodded to the Britannian butler who held the front door opened, and crossed the miniature manor's grounds. As soon as we crossed the threshold of the gate, Callan hustled me a block down the road, back the way we'd come. What the fuck was that about? Callan didn't yell, but instead let out an angry hiss of a whisper. Are you crazy? You should have done something yourself, I replied, keeping my tone coolly professional. It's one thing to maintain your cover, Callan, but it's another thing to participate in oppression. I turned towards the road and kept walking, feeling Callan fall into step with me this time. I saw you give money to that bus driver on the way here. If your cover identity as a Britannian noblewoman doesn't care about Japanese, that was a mistake. Since I can only assume that is not a part of your cover, you must have treated your mother like an 11 because of your personal animosity towards that woman. I stopped, and looked at Callan, catching her eyes. Callan, don't you realize she's your most valuable ally in that house? Your stepmother would be only too happy to steal your secrets and sell you and your brother out to the Britannian authorities. Besides, I'm sure she'd be happy to poison your tea someday as well, since you are, after all, just another 11 in her eyes, correct? None of the other servants can be trusted, especially if your father's new wife had a hand in hiring them. I could tell from the stubbornness in her eyes that I wasn't getting through on that front, and changed tact. How do you think your father is getting messages and supplies to your brother? Did you really think a man who can survive and thrive in the political waters of Britannia just kept his socially unacceptable former lover around out of the pity of his heart? There's always a reason. No skilled businessman makes an investment without a goal in mind. That got through. Callan's eyes widened in shock, just like her mother's, and she took a step back. You think that father is supporting Nato's actions? And mom's helping them. Either she'd already achieved a masterful level of espionage skills, or Lord Statfelt had never bothered to inform his daughter, a key agent, about his plan. What colossal foolishness. Clearly, I resumed walking back towards the bus stop, hitching my backpack up on my shoulders. Did you think he just tripped and fell into a pile of guns and cash? Rebellions, like any endeavor, require seed money. Where else would NATO get that money, or get military surplus transported across the Pacific? Besides, I paused, wondering if this might be going a bit over the top, but then pressed on. Besides, how is her infiltration of a noble's staff to watch over her daughter and assist her son in his actions different from your infiltration of Ashford Academy? We're all playing our roles in a greater plan, Callan, and we're all making sacrifices for Japan. After a few steps, I heard Callan start walking after me, but she didn't say anything. We walked back to the bus stop in silence, and waited for the next bus. 10 quiet minutes later, the bus pulled up and we got on, Callan absent-mindedly swiping her card through the scanner twice to pay our way. After an uncomfortable 20-minute ride, we got off in front of a Samway grocery store without speaking, though I noticed Callan drop a sizable bill into the bus driver's tip box as we left. I'm sorry. The words were out of my mouth before I knew it, but I just couldn't take the oppressive silence any longer. It felt like a social sword of Damocles was dangling over my neck, and I didn't know how to gracefully resolve the matter. I forgot about the plan, and I probably added unneeded complications to your home life. I apologize for my hasty overreaction. Callan inexplicably blushed, and stuttered out a no, before taking a calming breath and continuing. No, that's not it. Well, I am kinda upset that you hit that bitch before I got the chance to do it myself. But, I'm not angry. I'm just. She looked at me, and squinted just a bit as if she were trying to peer through my eyes and into my skull. Do you really think she's here to help me? She's not just trying to hang on to father like an idiot? I felt my anxiety lift away. Excellent. She's not mad. I won't need to try and find my way back to Shinjuku by myself. I can't guarantee anything. I'm not a mind reader, nor a liar. I tried to figure out how to phrase what I wanted to say as innocently as possible, considering we were standing on a public sidewalk with lots of people moving around. Your mother doesn't seem like the kind of woman who'd let herself be pushed around unless it was for a greater cause. Just like you, Callan, after all, she is your and your brother's mother. She's not helpless, and I doubt she's a fool. If she is your and your brother's mother, she's definitely a romantic, but not a total fool at least. After that last bit of drama, we finally got to the highlight of my whole day, and my main reason for risking my life by leaving Shinjuku, shopping for groceries. Britannian currency liberated from drug traffickers in hand, I followed Callan into the Samway. It was, even more than the rest of my trip, a culture shock. Every shelf was filled with every kind of packaged food and ingredient imaginable, and I could smell delicious fresh bread from the store's bakery, and the rich, greasy scent of rotisserie roasted chicken wafted over me from the nearby lunch counter. Despite all of my scorn for being X and its claims of godhood, for a moment I thought I had been whisked straight to heaven. After a heroic exercise of will, I managed to escape the Samway with my backpack and 2 sacks of groceries in hand, plus one of the whole chickens that had so tempted me. Chicken aside, I'd been strict with myself, and only purchased goods I knew to be dense in fats and proteins, and could be stored without a refrigerator. I had plenty of beans and nuts, 2 bags of oranges, several summer sausages, and as many onions and potatoes as I could cram into my backpack. I'd also purchased several large bottles of complex multivitamins, which would hopefully begin to offset some of the damages my earlier deprivation had done to my body. Of course, I'd also broken down and purchased several bars of chocolate and 2 small tins of coffee and a package of filters. Visha had once shown me how to make an impromptu coffee maker using only a standard imperial mess kit and a helmet, and I was sure I could replicate the feat, though I doubted it would be half as delicious as her brew had been. Am I doing the right thing, Visha? For once, thinking about my subordinate didn't make me hurt, and as we boarded the bus back to the stop near the Shinjuku checkpoint, I let my mind wander back to her. I remembered how eager she'd been to help me with the paperwork I generated to try getting out of creating the 203rd comma, foiling my plans with an eager smile and helpful hands. I'm sure you'd want me to fight, battle maniac that you were, but should I have tried to cozy up to Lady Stadtfeld instead? Gotten into the Britannian's good graces somehow? Idly, I wondered if she would have supported me in my sudden and unprovoked assault, or if she would have been as incredulous as Callan. Guess I'll never know. Damn the war, damn being X, and damn me. Callan waved goodbye as I passed through the checkpoint. The sergeant on duty had shook her hand again and let me pass through unimpeded, and I waved back as I juggled the grocery bags and the chicken. A few streets down, I found an out-of-the-way corner and changed back into my Shinjuku clothes, hiding the fresh outfit Callan had given me away in my backpack. It had only been a few hours since I'd last worn it, but somehow the filthy clothes made my skin crawl as I put them back on. Embarrassing. I scoffed at myself as I pulled Ogie's hoodie back on. Just a few hours of luxury and you've gone soft. Still, it had been nice to see people who didn't look 2 meals from death at any time, even if they were murderous bastards who'd kill me given half a chance. I wonder what it would have been like if being X had left me with my father instead of my mother this time around. I'd never really thought much about my father. As best I knew, he'd been a sailor whose condom had torn one night long ago in Tokyo. I certainly had no clue about his status, his personality, or anything else about the man, except that he'd had blonde hair and blue eyes like me. Still, after getting a brief taste of what it was like to live as Britannian, or at least a half-breed pretending to be a full Britannian, I wondered what my life would have been like. Neither Callan nor Naoto seemed particularly happy with the Britannian system, since both had taken up arms, but they were also nobles. Maybe the bias against half-breeds in the lower social orders wasn't as bad? That lazy bastard would never do me a favor. Peace was never really in the cards. Chicken in hand, I left the dismal corner and my weak thoughts of what could have been, and returned to my temporary home. I hoped Naoto would enjoy hearing about how I'd protected his mother's honor more than Callan had enjoyed watching it happen. 3 days after my trip outside of Shinjuku, I was back in the sub-basement with the rest of the Kozuki cell. I'd taken the opportunity to hand out some of the bottles of multivitamins to my terrorist comrades as they'd entered, thrusting a bottle into the hands of each man or woman who entered and encouraging them to take at least one daily to offset the lack of key nutrients in the usual Shinjuku grub. They accepted the pill bottles with various degrees of confusion, except for Ogi, who just smiled tolerantly as I forced a large 500-count bottle into his hands and promised to share them with Mrs. Mackey and her children down the hall. That small exercise in benevolent care and building social cohesion complete, I turned towards the business of the day, organizing a much larger example of benevolent care and building social cohesion between our small band and the greater Shinjuku population. At the moment, our people have nothing. I'd considered standing on top of a crate or something while conducting this meeting, but I decided it would indicate arrogance, or worse, insecurity. Instead, I sat on one of the couches, between Tamaki and Naoto. That might make them seem more dangerous on first appearance, but it's a double-edged sword. Ogi, seated across the battered coffee table from me, tilted his head, begging the question, and I obliged. If they have nothing, it means they are hopeless, and just lashing out at the world around them. As soon as their anger is spent, they'll lapse back into inert despondency, useless for any sort of prolonged effort, like removing the Britannians from our glorious land. A few tentative nods at that, but no indications of any buy-in quite yet. On the other hand, if we give our people something to fight for, some indication that things are getting better, they'll have something to defend, to protect, to fight for. Surprisingly, it was Nagata that finished my thought. He was a quiet man, and by far the one I'd had the least interaction with up to this point. It wasn't surprising that the only one at the table with a child would be the first to understand where I was going, thought. Exactly. And that should be where we make our first move. I reached down into my old, battered school bag, perched on my lap, and pulled out 6 half-used notebooks I'd managed to scavenge in the tenement over the last few days. That bag had been with me for years, longer than any other belonging to my name. My mother had bought it for me in my 2nd year of elementary school, when I was 5. I'd carried books in it for less than a year, then stuffed it with clothes and valuables when we'd been evicted from our home after the conquest, and I'd crammed my clothes and scarce toiletries into it again when I'd left our apartment after my mother's death. The hell are those for, Tanya? I jerked out of my brief reverie as Tamaki jostled me, knocking my bag onto the floor. I stooped down, thankful for the excuse to hide my embarrassed flush. This isn't the time to reminisce. I scolded myself as I collected the precious handful of pens that had cascaded out of the school bag. You're in a pitch meeting, even if it is with friends. Focus. Friends? That wasn't right, surely. They were colleagues, useful tools to get me as far from Shinjuku as possible. But that was the word my internal monologue had chosen. I straightened up, pens in hand, and thrust all the nonsense aside. I had a pitch to salvage from my unprofessional behavior. As I was saying, giving our people a stake in the future should be our first broad move towards rebuilding our nation. I started pushing a notebook and pen towards each of the others present as I continued. In order to connect with the local population, which will hopefully increase our reputation and get our name out as a force for good in Shinjuku, we first need to find out what they need. Handing the last notebook and pen to Naoto, I straightened back up, and started ticking possible topics off on my fingers. Do they need holes patched in their walls or windows before it starts to get really cold? Do they need leaky pipes patched so their homes aren't always wet? Do they need specific medicines or prescriptions? Extra food? A new blanket or jacket? I put my hand down and looked around at the rest of the cell. The best way to prove that we aren't another gang, that we're here for the people, is to address their needs in a concrete and immediate way. Let them know that they'll get something out of supporting us, and we're even willing to go out of our way to help them out first. This wasn't a new tactic by any means. In my own first life, the Yakuza had done much the same, acting as benevolent associations and the like to solve problems for whoever was willing to make a deal. In this world, however, the gangs in Shinjuku had long since dropped such civilized pretensions, instead revealing their own base nature by sucking up to the Britannians and brutalizing their fellow Japanese. I was just using their old tactics against the damned coppos. All of us are going to spend the next few days talking to people. I felt Naoto stir slightly, but pressed on. Hopefully he wouldn't be too offended by the liberties I was taking, but he had told me I could make plans as I'd wished. Really, this was all on him. He was our leader after all. He just delegated authority to me. Try to find people you don't ordinarily talk to, and ask them what they need. If they say they need something reasonable, tell them we'll get it for them. The same day I'd met with the cell in the hideout, Callan had filed paperwork with the Area 11 administration to create the Rising Sun Benevolent Association, a non-religious charitable association dedicated to improving public health and fostering loyalty towards the Empire among the Savage 11s. The newly founded Rising Sun Benevolent Association had a P.O. Box headquarters address, located at the nearest post office to Ashford Academy, and was headed by a rival's Cardi Mund, apparently a classmate of Callan's. The inclusion of an Ashford Academy student in a charity focused on providing aid to 11s was a surprise, to say the least, but Callan had really come through for me on this. When researching the requirements for founding an officially recognized charitable organization, I had discovered that all charities must be sponsored by a noble of some rank, and must be headed by a noble as well. I assumed that this particular regulation was generally used to award positions to unwanted scions of noble houses, who would then abuse their unearned offices to embezzle funds. This discovery had practically led to me scrapping the whole idea for a charity, since the only noble connections we had were the Stagefelds, and connecting their name to a front organization for the Kozuki organization was a tremendous risk. Fortunately, after I had complained over Naoto's phone about that self-serving bit of regulation, Callan had asked for me to wait a day before scrapping the plan. The next day, she'd arrived at Naoto's apartment, half-completed paperwork in hand, and told me she'd found a noble who was willing to be our frontman. I was curious about how she had recruited this rivals to our cause, but when I asked, she'd blushed furiously and left, to Naoto's great amusement. I hoped she wasn't doing anything too immoral, since that might endanger her placement at Ashford Academy, but I trusted her to know what she was doing. Callan was willing to fight and die for the cause. I would be willing to trust her judgment. The long and short of it was that the newly official Rising Sun Benevolent Association was a recognized charity, with a pass to transport humanitarian aid into the ghetto through the 11's only checkpoint. Callan had taken a large quantity of the Britannian currency my truck job had netted and purchased a large amount of packed foodstuffs, multivitamins and basic over-the-counter medications, sanitary and hygiene goods, and used clothes. As soon as Naoto called to let her know that we had secured a location to store and distribute the goods from, Callan had rented a small truck to haul the shipment of goods into Shinjuku. Of course, Nagata on a day work pass had to enter the Britannian concession and drive the thing back, but with the protection of the charity's pass that hadn't been a difficult matter. The guards hadn't even required a large bribe, only taking a small processing fee to let the truck and its cargo proceed without trouble. And so, 4 days after I had set my Shinjuku revitalization plan into motion, Tamaki and Ogi nailed a sign hand-painted by Naomi over the door of our new office, announcing the opening of the Rising Sun Benevolent Society. As soon as the sun rose over Shinjuku, a steady trickle of people began to come in through the open door of the Benevolent Society. Ino, Ogi, and I were inside waiting for them, standing in front of a series of tables. "Welcome to the Rising Sun Benevolent Society." The early morning muttering cut out abruptly as I raised my voice over the din, hopping up on a table covered with neatly folded second-hand clothing. "If you need food for yourselves or your family, please talk to Ino." The indigo-headed woman waved her hand, and moved to stand in front of a table heavily laden with packed boxes. Ino and I had put them together last night, and each box contained enough food for a family of 4 to eat for a day, plus a small baggie of multivitamins, a few pieces of candy, and a box of matches and 3 tampons or sanitary napkins. "If you need new clothes, take what you need from the tables." Callan had found a discount location where unsold stocks of clothes from some of the cheaper chains were offloaded, as well as a number of thrift shops, and had managed to collect plenty of pants, shirts, and light jackets, with a small heap of shoes thrown in and a supply of underwear and socks. The stores had assured her that it had all been washed, and true or not, nobody here was in any condition to be choosy. "And if you're here to work, come talk to me," I continued. "Lunch will be provided, and there are a number of small luxury items available for those who work a full day." I held up a Zippo lighter and a safety razor in one hand, and a chocolate bar and a pack of cigarettes in the other. "Any questions?" "Yeah, I got a question." The speaker, a shaggy-haired, bespectacled man, pushed his way through the throng of Japanese milling about, and jabbed a finger at me. "Who the hell are you, and why should we listen to some Brit kid, huh?" Can't say this comes as a surprise. Ogi had been pretty sure someone would remark on my race, pointing out that while he knew I was Japanese, the random man off the street wouldn't take kindly to being bossed around by an apparent Britannian. I was somewhat miffed that he thought I'd just be bossing people around, instead of leading them to a mutually constructed better future, but I conceded his point. We'd then discussed possible responses to such race-based pushback, a discussion I had kicked off by demanding that he only resort to physical force as the last option, or in self-defense. Ogi had looked somewhat confused, presumably because I preemptively muzzled his preferred first response, but thankfully his professionalism won out over his bloodlust. "She's one of us," Ogi replied, stepping forward until he was in front of the table I stood upon, and just within an arm's reach from the questioner. "She's a Hafu and she grew up in Shinjuku. But if you don't want to listen to her because of her hair, then listen to me. We're here to help out the people of Shinjuku, and it's all thanks to her." Ogi's intervention was just as planned, putting an undeniably Japanese, not to mention adult and male, face on my endeavor. And between Ogi acting his role to perfection and Ino's none too subtle positioning of her hand on the butt of her sidearm, that was the end of any objection. Soon, a queue had formed in front of Ino's table, each person taking a box and getting a stamp on their left hand to show they'd received aid for the day. before moving down to the tables of clothing and taking what they needed. Several of the younger men and women clustered around Ogi, including the man who'd questioned my presence. After building up a sufficient number of able hands, Ogi led them out onto the street and towards the first location on the list I'd given him, consisting of all the easily resolved issues the cell members had learned about in their first round of canvassing. The volunteers left with hand tools, scavenged plywood and lumber, a few bags of quick-dry cement in a wheelbarrow, cork, and tarps, which they'd be putting to use sealing broken windows or hold walls in various apartments and structures in Shinjuku, preparing for the winter soon to be upon us. I spent the remainder of the day distributing boxes and clothes with Inno, encouraging all who came through to tell their friends and family about the Rising Sun Benevolent Society, and to come to us if they needed help with anything at all. After the initial burst of visitors, the queue slowly petered out as the people who'd heard about us left with their free food and fresh clothes, which gave Inno and I time to assemble more boxes for distribution the next day, although she, Tamaki, and Naoto would be in charge of Benevolent Society affairs tomorrow, as Ogi, Nagata and I had other business to handle. I was sure that our quartermaster would be able to ride herd on Tamaki, and Naoto would do a fine job leading the repair crew, considering his charisma and leadership skills. And so, as half our cell went about the benevolent activities that would build the Kozuki organization's PR in Shinjuku, I met with the other fruit of my plan. For the first time since I had arrived, outsiders were present in our hideout. 2 outsiders, to be exact, 1 male and 1 female. They sat on the couch across the table from Ogi and I, as Nagata leaned against the wall behind them. Both were vouched for by at least one member of the cell, but hopefully knowing that they were surrounded would discourage any thoughts of betrayal. Matsumoto Suichiro was a broad-shouldered middle-aged man, with the slightly run-down build of a muscular man gone underfed and underworked. He'd tried to look professional for this meeting, wearing a stain-white shirt and threadbare tie, but the stubble encrusting his face and the deep-set dark eyes betrayed the shaky foundations under the firm exterior. This was a man desperate for a way out, a reason to keep on fighting, and a lifeline in a hopeless situation. I'd seen many eyes like that on the Rhine front. Mr. Matsumoto had come to us with Tamaki's recommendation. Apparently, before his untimely death, Tamaki's father had been a local policeman in Shinjuku before the war. While the majority of his father's comrades had died during the brutal urban combat that had ravaged Shinjuku during the conquest, Suichiro had been visiting family in Gunma Prefecture during the worst of it. Unfortunately for him, instead of capitalizing on his luck at being outside Shinjuku when the hammer had fallen, he had rushed back to try and find his wife and older son, who had remained in Shinjuku. Sadly, both had died in the fighting, and now Mr. Matsumoto and his surviving son were stuck in Shinjuku as the Britannians began to tighten their hold on the region. Reading between the lines of Tamaki's report, Matsumoto Suichiro was looking for some sign that his son would inherit a better world. The young man was old enough to make his own way in the world, and had managed to secure a position as an honorary Britannian, so clearly Suichiro had done a fine job of raising him, but no doubt the empty nest had spurred him to accept Tamaki's invitation to meet with us today. In contrast, the other prospective recruit was 19-year-old Tanaka Chihiro, a former student of Ogi's in better times. During his brief time as a teacher before the conquest, she'd been the star student of his math class. But after the dislocating confusion of the conquest and the closure of his school, she disappeared into the vast refugee population. Recently, Chihiro and her surviving little sister had ended up in Shinjuku as another result of the ongoing Britannian land grab, and she'd happened to run into Ogi in the street. When I'd asked my comrades to find people willing to fight, Ogi had thought of his old student, and I could easily understand why. She was tall for a girl, just an inch shorter than Ogi, and her somewhat mannish appearance was reinforced by her cropped hair and the male clothing she wore just as I did. It was clear that the last 5 years hadn't been any kinder to Chihiro than the rest of us, and her forearms and face were speckled with small burn scars from her time working in a factory to provide for her sister. She carried herself with the same guarded energy as most unaccompanied young women in Shinjuku, but Chihiro's eyes were like a furnace, full of scorching rage and hate. Yes, I could understand why Ogi, whose cruelty was like a fishhook hidden inside an innocuous candy, would choose to recruit this girl into our cell. I decided to start our meeting with a thematically appropriate icebreaker. Why are you here? Why do you want to fight Britannia and all our people's foes? Suichiro started to speak, stop, and badly concealed his false start with a cough. Chihiro took the initiative and plowed forward. This world is garbage, and garbage must be burned. She locked eyes with me as she began her tirade, and I was struck by a memory of a young man looking up at me from a crowd of newly minted refugees. The Britannians have taken everything from me but my sister, my parents, my friends, my boyfriend, everything. They took our home. They took everything we had. I want to take everything from them, Chihiro continued, her words coming faster and faster in gush of verbal lava. I want to see every single Britannian bastard who ever set foot on this damned island gutted in the street. I want to see the damned city they built on our graves burned. I want them to suffer, just like we all have for the last 5 years. I nodded my understanding. I could very much understand that passion. If I ever got the chance, I'd love to splash about in being X's entrails myself, as the first evil bastard to rip me away from my secure life of comfort and freedom. I could sympathize with Chihiro's wholehearted willingness to kill every Britannian who'd had a hand in the destruction of her old life. That said, such a fire was dangerous. I remembered the fire in Shugel's eyes, his single-minded devotion to his goal despite all the losses. But for all I'd hated that bastard, in the end he'd merely been a tool in the hand of the one directing his passion. If I could do the same with Chihiro, and if I could temper her hunger for violence with discipline and control, she would be valuable indeed. Of course, if she proved to simply be an attack dog, an uncontrolled blaze instead of a reliable controlled burn, well, it would be a shame if it came to that. It would certainly make Ogi sad, and I wouldn't want him as any enemy, but I wouldn't allow Chihiro's fire to burn our people, nor our secret master. Ultimately, the first provided me with power, and the later was my ticket to a better life, and I refused to be like the idiot rebels from the first years of the occupation who just increased the number of Japanese dead without any productive result. Chihiro slowly wound down, her frantic babble gradually slowing as she began to repeat herself, and I held up a hand for silence. Thank you, Mr. Naka. For all her lack of control, her passion was admirable. It reminded me of the feeling that had led me to carrying a firearm at all times, in the futile hope that I could shoot Being X whenever he next appeared. I commend the depths of your ardor. I'm certain we can work together to once again see Japan breathe free. I turned back to Suichiro. And what about you, Mr. Matsumoto? Why are you here? The former policeman shifted uncomfortably for a second, before looking up and meeting my eyes. My son has betrayed us. I've come to avenge his shame. As far as openings went, it was certainly dramatic. Beyond that, I suddenly realized that I had once again misunderstood the actions of those around me. I'd spent too long in Europe, and the hardcore Japanese national pride had faded somewhat in the world of my first life, but that old national pride was still strong here. In this world the Japanese Empire had never been crushed, only the republic that had followed it, and the emperor had never had to forswear his divinity on radio in front of the nation. Worse, the miracle of Itsukushima and the continued survival of the military hardliners in the mountains had preserved Japanese pride, despite the conquest. I should have known a proud Japanese man, raised in the time of Japan's greatest economic and cultural prosperity, wouldn't take pride in his son becoming an honorary Britannian. Instead of appreciating his son's choice of a path towards some degree of security and comfort, Matsumoto Suichiro could only see a traitor. What a damned shame, I couldn't help but think, even as I sympathized with Suichiro's feelings. I didn't hold any particular grudge against the honorary Britannians who helped keep the colonial system going, but I did resent how the choice had never really been in the cards for me. When his mother and brother died, I did my best to raise him to be a good Japanese man, Suichiro continued, every tense word laden with barely concealed pain. I tried to teach him about the kami, about the traditions and the pride of his ancestors. But I don't think I ever really got through to him. He saw the occupation, saw the strength of the Britannians, and the death of his older brother. Suichiro heaved a sigh, and suddenly looked even older than before, the tie hanging limply down from his neck, shoulders hunched. He's not Japanese. He's 11. My only son. My Kenji. He's taken a Britannian name now. He goes by Keith instead of the name his mother and I gave him. I've lost him. I've lost both my sons. There was a moment of silence. I didn't know quite what to say to that. I'd never been a parent, thankfully, and when I'd been in the military, questions of loyalty could be easily resolved, if push came to shove. But for a wayward child, a child who had seen the way the wind was blowing and made his choice. Sharper than a serpent's tooth indeed. Suichiro took a deep breath, and continued. The emotional tremble was gone from his voice, replaced with a cold, leaden weight. I can't kill him myself. For all that he's become. I remember him as a little boy. I can't kill my own son. But if I can't wipe away his shame by ending him, then this old man will do whatever else I can to avenge the man he would have been if Britannia hadn't come. The Britannians killed Kenji's future when they killed his brother and mother. I want the opportunity to kill their future too. Thank you for telling me about your son. I began, stalling as I tried to marshal my thoughts. How do you respond to something like that? I was far from the most emotionally connected person, typically maintaining a degree of professional separation from my co-workers and comrades to preserve efficiency, but even I quailed at the calm way Suichiro discussed the possible execution of his son for treachery, presumably. Being a product of the Japanese educational system, I understood in concept the fear of disappointing one's parents, though I'd never personally felt it in any of my lives. I'd never really feared either of my families, and no matter how desperate things had gotten after the conquest, I never thought my mother might try to murder me. But I'd never chosen to side with my oppressors either. Neither the Britannians nor Being X had given me any other choices than utter capitulation or resistance, and neither had successfully exploited my moments of weakness. Matsumoto Kenji, on the other hand, had joined the Britannian system willingly, and for Matsumoto Suichiro, that made him the enemy. For what it's worth, I couldn't bring myself to push forward on his urge to avenge the son he'd never truly had. For what it's worth, I believe you did your best. The time since the conquest has been hard for us all. I don't blame you for what your son has chosen. I hope you will join us in our efforts to make a new Japan, where our sons and daughters will be able to be proud of being Japanese once again. Suichiro simply nodded at that, and looked down at the floor. He still looked shaky, no doubt the typical Japanese attitude towards publicly expressing emotion biting hard. Chihiro, by contrast, sat stiffly on the couch, head high and fiery eyes locked onto me. It was quite disconcerting, the way she didn't blink. I moved on from the icebreaker into the next stage of the interview process, introducing the company. We here at the Kozuki organization are trying to free and rebuild Japan. We are a relatively new organization and have yet to truly make an impression, but with your help, we can provide a better life to the people in Shinjuku. Our aims are to make concrete improvements in the quality of life of the Japanese, to remove the Britannian occupation from our homeland, and to redeclare the Republic of Japan once more, in that order. Suichiro had looked back up, stern mask back in place. He and Chihiro were simply looking at me, presumably waiting for the rest of the pitch, so I continued. Unlike previous rebel groups in Shinjuku, we aim to take the longer view towards freeing our people. Instead of simply knifing lone soldiers in alleyways and provoking retaliation against the people of Shinjuku, we plan on building a firm power base in the ghetto, from which to launch more significant actions. As it is still early days for the Kozuki organization, we are currently focused on removing the influence of the gangs that collaborate with the Britannians and poison our people, and providing material support for our people. We will not be immediately attacking the Britannians, you understand. I am not going to simply throw away Japanese lives without meaningful gains. I met Suichiro's eyes, and waited for a nod of confirmation before looking to Chihiro. She looked a bit rebellious, smoldering with resentment at not immediately being unleashed on the Britannians no doubt, but she gave a reluctant nod of assent as well. Excellent. I'm happy to welcome you both to the Kozuki organization. I'll introduce you to our leader, and to the rest of the cell tomorrow. I smiled the sunny smile of every HR manager and recruiter, blandly positive, and inwardly rejoiced. A small step, but our first successful recruitment is a big achievement. Now, have either of you ever used a gun? Suichiro, as it turned out, had used a gun during his basic police training, but not since, as Japanese police were typically only equipped with batons. Chihiro had never touched a gun, but was incredibly eager to learn. I delegated Oki to start teaching them the ins and outs of firearm safety and maintenance, and left the new pair of recruits in his able hands. Nagata and I headed out of the hideout, and began making our way towards his apartment building. He'd also found a potential recruit, but for a number of reasons this one would require a degree of special handling. He was an engineer, you see, before the war. As we walked, Nagata gave me a quick overview on the man we were going to see. I'm not sure what his exact specialty was, but he was pretty highly paid. Respectable. Anyway, it must have been something to do with machinery, because he's earned his food and rent since then by repairing and maintaining stoves, hot plates, clocks. You name it, he can fix it. So, presumably a mechanical engineer of some type, huh? I turned the thought over in my mind. Beyond the maintenance skills he could bring to the table, recruiting a man with an engineering skill set opened up all sorts of possible options for the organization, most specifically bomb making. Every insurgency worth its salt in the last 2 decades of my first life had deployed improvised explosives, and it seemed fitting to follow suit. So why would a man with a nice safe job want to get wrapped up in our little adventure, That's just it. Nagata sidestepped around a pothole, and carefully stepped over a downed power line. He's not safe. About a year ago, he caught a stray round from a Britannian. They suspected that an apartment in the next building over was a safe house for some group or another, and went in guns blazing. They smoked a couple of gangsters, which wasn't really what they were going for, but they also managed to hit lots of unlucky people, including Mr. Asahara. The bullet went right through his wall and through his left shin, shattering the bone. Worse yet, it got infected. They had to amputate it below the knee. We're recruiting a cripple? Well, I guess you don't need 2 legs to make bombs. I see. That's a good reason to resent the Britannians. Nagata nodded. Yup. Plus, he was a bit weird, even before that. He hesitated a bit, clearly looking for the right words. He's a bit of a political guy, you see. He's very anti-monarchist, and whenever he gets drunk he starts ranting about the rights of the citizen and so on and so forth. So, he's got a personal beef with Britannia for shooting his leg off, and a political beef since the Britannians rule by the divine right of kings? Nagata nodded. You can see why I thought he'd be a good fit for our organization, right? Absolutely. Nagata had struck gold. A political ideologue was useful, as they had a reason beyond the personal to fight, and the specialist skills this Asahara Hayashi brought to the table were even more useful. Now, all that was left was to make a pitch. Asahara Hayashi turned out to be a well-preserved man in his mid-50s, spotted with oil and grease but with clear eyes, a well-maintained salt and pepper mustache and goatee, and silver wings in his otherwise still black hair. He also turned out to be an immensely infuriating person, full to the brim with an arrogance that losing his job, his property, and his leg had not diminished in the slightest. When Nagata knocked on his door, he opened it readily enough, supported on his weak side by a crutch, but refused to let us in until both Nagata and I had formally introduced ourselves and requested his permission to enter. I suppose losing a good deal of personal autonomy along with a limp probably warped his personality, but his behavior was already irritating. The recruitment effort didn't go any better than the initial introduction had. Good afternoon, Mr. Asahara. I came here today to ask why. How's that tricky pressure cooker doing, Takeshi? Still working? The old bastard hadn't bothered to acknowledge my introduction beyond a curt nod, and as soon as I began my pitch he cut me off and began talking to Nagata. You know I warned you that the gasket would need replacement soon. I hope you aren't putting that off. Nagata shot an apologetic look at me, before turning back to the engineer. No, Mr. Asahara. I still haven't found anyone willing to part with a new gasket for a reasonable price. You know how supplies getting short, with all the new guys pouring into Shinjuku. Hayashi snorted derisively. You're just not looking hard enough. If you bring that damned thing back again without replacing the parts I told you to, I'm charging double. And on it went. Nagata periodically tried to introduce me into the conversation, or bring up the reason why we'd come, but Hayashi would simply bull forwards with his chosen topic, ignoring all attempts to be diverted. After 45 minutes of rambling small talk, I'd had enough. Are you content, tinkering with cookware and clocks, or do you want to do something to get revenge for your missing leg? Subtle it was not, but I had gotten tired of waiting for this miserable old geezer to get to the point. Hopefully a bit of youthful impertinence would move the conversation along before the Britannians finished exterminating us all. Instead of the anger I'd expected from the prickly man, Hayashi simply snorted with mild amusement and shook his head. The amusement didn't reach his eyes, though, which were just as serious and intense as they'd been since we entered his apartment. Save your breath. I'm not desperate enough to follow the whims of a child. Come back in 10 years when you can drink, and if we're both still alive, make your pitch then. And then he simply returned to nagging Nagato about the proper way to strip copper wire from abandoned houses, an operation that Hayashi had a surprising wealth of knowledge about. I wasn't going to be so easily dissuaded. If an appeal to conviction would just be shot down out of hand, another tack was required. Fine. You don't want to help the rest of us out of the goodness of your heart? How about commissions? I have Britannian cash available, or meth if you'd prefer payment in drugs instead. At the sight of the wad of cash I brought out of my sweatshirt pocket, as well as the small baggie of crystals, the old vulture's eyes sharpened. That's the hook, self-interest. Hayashi was a man after my own heart, in a way. Clearly, the cutthroat capitalism of pre-conquest Japan had left a stamp on the man. And if that's the coin you need, I'm willing to pay. After that, it was all over except for the dickering. Hayashi readily admitted to knowing how to rig up any number of explosive devices, including remote cell phone-activated devices, clockwork-triggered devices, and chemical time bombs, where the ignition source was a chemical reaction delayed by a thin membrane that gradually broke down, mixing the solvents until a threshold was crossed. We finally settled on a hefty payment, costing almost half of my remaining cash reserves and a 20th of the amphetamines we'd secured, as well as supplying some components Hayashi required. In exchange, the crippled engineer would provide us with 5 cell phone detonated pipe bombs, each capable of producing an omnidirectional spray of shrapnel guaranteed to reduce anything in a 20-meter radius to chopped meat, and capable of rendering unarmored vehicles within a 5-meter radius inoperable. As we shook on the deal, I looked up into Hayashi's bespectacled eyes, and clamped down hard on his hand with my own. I appreciate doing business with you, Mr. Asahara, and I hope we can continue to do so in the future. I kept calm, as I used my free hand to shift my sweatshirt up, revealing the pistol holstered under the baggy folds. I hope we have a long and productive working relationship, which will be guaranteed if your devices are all that you have promised. If they aren't, however, be assured. I felt the blood beginning to hammer in my ears as my grasp tightened. I was gratified to see a faint wince cross Hayashi's face, quickly smoothed away. I'll start by taking the leg the Britannians left you as payment for services rendered, and continue on until your account is paid in full. To the old man's credit, he actually laughed at that. I'm not an idiot, you crazy hafu. You think you're the first one to buy my work, I'm not stupid enough to try double-crossing people who buy bombs. It's bad business, and I frankly don't care what you and your pack of idiots blow up. With a nod and a final, hard, shake, I released his hand, and dropped the down payment on the table. Nagato will be by tomorrow to drop off the materials you requested, and we'll be back in a few days to pick up the devices and detonators, in exchange for the remainder of your pay. As we left, I mulled over the results of the last 2 days. We were 2 recruits stronger, though both were admittedly unblooded and untrained, and had begun to buy the affections of the Shinjuku crowd. I'd also successfully negotiated 5 explosive devices with the possibility of further future purchases, which would undoubtedly come in handy in the near future. Unfortunately, not only had we expended virtually all of the income and resources acquired from the truck hijacking, I had also resorted to strong-arm tactics with Mr. Asahara. Not only did that leave a bad taste in my mouth, but it also potentially planted a seed that could flower into open resentment in due time. I'd need to find some way to both replenish the cell's depleted coffers, and nip any problems stemming from a disgruntled contractor with a dangerous skill set and an abrasive personality. Pity I can't simply cut off his funding, like I did with Shukel. Fortunately, I already had a target in mind that would serve as both a source of income and a convenient testing ground for Asahara's products. Ideally, My next plan would both begin the process of removing the gangs from the Shinjuku ghetto, and would give me a chance to thoroughly blood all members of the cell. The first kill is always the hardest, so it's kinder to them to ensure it happens in a reasonably straightforward situation, I reasoned. A minimum of danger, and a straightforward moral situation, it's the best of both worlds. Hopefully,